everyone. This has been Kelly with the Endeavoring Orthodoxy podcast. I'm bringing you another episode this week. Today, we're going to talk about how critical theory really integrates itself and interacts with theology. Last week, you heard me talk about certain presuppositions that critical theory has when it gets into theology. And so, what I want to do today is I actually want to demonstrate how this happens, how this works. And I'm going to do that by reading to you an actual scholarly article written by a Dr. Paul Hedges, as his name. He's a professor of interreligious studies over in Singapore. And I'm going to read an article he wrote called White Jesus and Anti-Semitism Toward an Anti-Racist and Decolonial Christology. I'm going to read this article. I'm going to explain it paragraph by paragraph, and I'm going to show you how my presuppositions that I demonstrated to you last week, how they really ring true in an article like this. Hedges is definitely a theorist. He is using critical theory to deconstruct Christology, which is our doctrine of Christ. And what we're going to see here is we're going to see a deconstruction of Western Christianity's understanding of the person and work of Jesus Christ in this article. So I don't want to spend too much time focusing on the presuppositions from last week. If you haven't listened to that episode, you should really go back and listen to it first before getting into here, because I'm going to reference those presuppositions throughout this episode. And if you don't know what they are, if you don't understand how I explain them, then you're going to really struggle through this. But I'm going to read this article, White Jesus and Anti-Semitism Toward an Anti-Racist and Decolonial Christology. We'll start with the abstract. For those of you who don't know what an abstract is is sometimes a scholarly journal will ask for its writers to provide an abstract, which is a one paragraph description of what the paper is about. And so this really helps when you're doing research. You can read through an abstract in very little time and decide, does this paper contain the information I need for my research project? I use them all the time. I love them. But we're going to read the abstract, and it's going to give you an idea of what's going on in this paper before we actually dive into it and get into the meat of it. So the abstract starts with, this article argues that traditional Christology, again, traditional understandings of the doctrine of Christ, his work and his person, is intimately bound up with a triumphalist agenda that denies Jesus's Jewishness and is structurally anti-Semitic. Now that is a big claim right there. And so what he's saying is that traditional Western theology on how we understand Christ is related to triumphalism and does not understand the true context of Jesus's Jewishness, and therefore it is clearly anti-Jewish. And so moving on, he says, taking an anti-racist stance. Now, if you don't know what anti-racist means, I'm going to tell you, but most likely, excuse me, it can mean a few different things for different people. But most likely, what it means for Hedges here is that anti-racism really, it's not just about picking out certain sins or certain actions that are racist. No, it identifies racism within a structure and then declares that entire structure to be systematically racist. And so what he's setting up here is he's going to tie anti-Semitism to anti-racism. He's going to see anti-Semitism in the history of Western theology, and he's going to say that entire system is racist because there are certain things in the past that have happened that are anti-Semitic. And so, taking an anti-racist stance, the article argues that systematic rethinking, there I go, there you go. I already told you, he's going to talk about how the whole system is broken. Systemic rethinking of Christianity's theological resources is needed, which must be anti-Semitic and anti-racist. This involves reconfiguring how we take on board Jesus's Jewishness in a post-Holocaust context and recognizing Jesus as a Jewish prophet. From this, it is tentatively suggested that rethinking the role of the Messiah is needed. There's a few things in here that we don't need to talk about because it gets a little bit into the weeds of some other scholars there. But what he's going to say is, but rather it calls upon us to act in a messianic role before the other as an ethical imperative. So what he's going to say there is that we need to rethink Jesus as not the Son of God, how we understand this in traditional Western theology, but as a Jewish Messiah whose message was to treat other people ethically. Now, I don't know what kind of ethics he's thinking about, but this is clearly a different kind of Jesus than what we have traditionally found in Western Christianity, really in all of the history of Christianity. And so that is the abstract. We can already see right away this is a clear divergence away from normative theology. And so we go to the introduction. It says, it is a truth that hardly needs stating. Jesus was Jewish, and so were his disciples and early followers. Moreover, we may add he was a Middle Eastern, even Palestinian Jew. All right. Now that yes is true that he's Palestinian Jew. That's pretty easy to understand there. What's interesting in using that kind of language for a critical theorist like Hedges is that Palestine is kind of seen as a victim worldwide by these progressives, these critical theorists, and they really side with Palestine as a victim against Israel, who is seen as normative culture. And this has some interesting bearings on how we might understand dispensational theology, for example. I'm not a dispensationalist. If you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. Go look it up. For dispensational theology, the relationship of the church and literal Israel is a big thing. And so if that relationship is deconstructed through critical means and we side with Palestine more, well, we see more of, Western Christianity being deconstructed for the sake of ethical critical theory. And so this is just a little way that he's poking fun of, dispensational theology, really making it a point to talk about Jesus as a Palestinian Jew. He goes into a footnote there and talks about how, he says, for some contemporary Palestinian Christians, recognizing Jesus as both a victim of suffering and a Palestinian resonates with their experiences. The identification of Jesus as Palestinian may be controversial for some, but that Jesus was born in Roman Palestine makes it a possible way of speaking of the historical figure of Jesus of Nazareth. And that's totally true. There's nothing wrong with saying that. But, in the context of this article, you can see what he's doing with that. He's really trying to poke at some Western ideas of theology there, especially those who have a strong tie to literal Israel in their theology. So he moves on in the introductory paragraph. However, while academic theology has more or less taken this on board, we still face the white Jesus, dare I say Aryan Jesus, as a normative in theological and ecclesial language and culture. In what has been described as the Latin captivity of the church, a Eurocentrism has become normal. Now, this comment makes it sound like the early patristic church, which is the church of the first 5 centuries, and the medieval church have taken captive the true identity of the church, which Jesus instituted in the New Testaments in the gospel. This is not an uncommon argument used by critics of the New Testament, who would often make arguments that the New Testament has changed. It was changed by the church in the first few centuries to root out all Jewishness in the scriptures so that the church could resemble the world of Greek philosophy rather than Jewish religion. This is a very common argument used in biblical criticism by left wing, you know, biblical critics, theologians, things like that. And so, and it really doesn't have any merit because we don't have great evidence for it. So, but he really wants you to assume this and take it for granted within this article. So the next paragraph reads, today, against this, it is generally accepted that we need to enculturate Christianity to local contexts around the world. However, such enculturation is often focused not upon the Jewish Jesus, but upon the white Jesus. This is to say, enculturation is seen to be something that happens when Christianity, as it has been transported from Europe, becomes indigenized elsewhere in Asia, Africa, and so on. And that's a big topic that people talk about today. Are we contextualizing Christianity to cultures around the world as we go on mission to those different cultures? This is something that I had to take an entire class on in seminary, talking about how we need to present Jesus in ways that are really relevant to the culture we're going into. Some of it's good, some of it had made me scratch my head, felt like maybe some of the gospel was being left behind in it, but we're not going to talk about that right now. But that's what he's talking about there. How it is generally accepted today that there needs to be a way to enculturate Christianity into local contexts. However, what he's saying is when we do this today in our missions, we're not enculturating the Jewish Jesus, the historical Jesus, if you will. We're enculturating the white Jesus, the Eurocentric Jesus. He goes on to read, within academic theology and both research and teaching, the canon remains centered on a Euro-normative corpus. Okay, so what he means is that when we do theology today, we're really focused on, especially looking back into history, we are really focused on a Eurocentric set of theologians. Then he goes on to say whether it is Barth, Tillich, Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, Hauerwas. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Stanley Hauerwas. I've never really interacted with him much, or Ranner. Such white Western writers remain the standard works. Non-Western theology, when it is included, remains a footnote as contextual theology. And so, what does he mean there? He's saying that when we go to talk about theology, these are the writers that are taking up our time. We're doing a lot with them, and we're not so much looking at these other theologians from non-Western places. Now, excuse me, let's see here. This kind of comment it's extremely frustrating to me because every theologian listed here is not just a big name in theology. When we talk about Barth, Tillich, Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, Hauerwas, and Ranner, but these are all men who were responsible for drastically changing the path of theology in their time of history. And so this is an undeniable fact, whether I agree with their theology or not. Barth was largely responsible for the neo-Orthodox movement in the early 20 to mid 20th century. He wrote against liberal theology that had dominated for well over a century, and he's considered to be the one who intellectually triumphed over liberal theology. Tillich was responsible for changing the idea of understanding existence and being in the person of God. And I don't want to get into his complicated theology right now, but he really did a number on conservative theology students during his time. I believe he was in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So he has a deep impact on what's going on. Aquinas is another theological giant that has been recognized for incorporating Aristotelian philosophy, the philosophy of Aristotle into Christian theology. Before Aquinas, before his time, the works of Aristotle had been lost to the Western world. They were in more of the Eastern world and they were being read, but people didn't have Aristotle to read. And when Aristotle came in to, I believe it was being taught in France around Aquinas's time, Aquinas acquires it, and he takes it and he works it into his theology. And he's really known for that. And that's something, he changes the course of theology by doing that. Martin Luther was the leader of the Reformation. We need to say any more about that? John Calvin gave rise to a formidable theological school, and that was named after himself. So, Hauerwas gave politically left-leaning Christians in the 20th century, and he's still alive, by the way. It gave him a home in broader evangelicalism. So he's still very influential, Christian today. I don't even know if his theology is any good, honestly. I read a little bit about it, didn't like what I saw, but I haven't really studied him too much. And Ranner fundamentally changed Roman Catholic theology with his influence on Vatican II and his challenge on Thomistic theology, which is the theology of Thomas Aquinas. Ranner was known for locating the revelation of God more in our experience. And I don't like that. I don't think that's good theology, but he changed the course of theology. So all these people here that Hedges lists, these theologians that he says, well, we focus on these too much. It's Euro-normative, and when we use these other non-Western theologies, they're really a footnote. Well, these theologians were responsible for changing the history of theology. And so while I understand that, yes, they are Euro-normative, they're big names too. And so that's definitely an interesting idea that he uses there. Also, the list of theologians, it's like a who's who of historical theology, but he interestingly, Hedges that is, he interestingly left out one major contributor, and that's Augustine. Now, besides Aquinas, all of these other theologians really they really pale in comparison to Augustine's influence. And I wonder why Hedges leaves out Augustine and doesn't talk to him. And honestly, I think it could be that Augustine was an African man living in a Roman province. He was not a white European. He was not a North American male. So therefore, Augustine doesn't really fit the narrative that Hedges is attempting to weave and to argue against you. And so that's just my opinion. That's just how I'm reading it. But it is interesting that in a list of who's who of theologians, that he would include someone like Hauerwas instead of Augustine. That just doesn't make sense. Or Tillich, that just doesn't make sense. So continuing with the article here, certainly there are other trends. Actually, I'm not going to read that paragraph. We're going to go on, skip a few paragraphs. So I will skip some paragraphs in here. So this paper locates itself in these debates by specifically questioning the image of Jesus in relation to Judaism, but it also raises wider questions about the white Jesus of the Christian imagination. I will suggest that images of Jesus, the biblical text, and notions of Christology are more generally remain problematic from an anti-racist perspective in relation to both anti-Semitism and racism stemming from a white Eurocentric Jesus. So did you catch what he was saying there? He said the Jesus of Scripture is being deconstructed at the hands of the anti-racist ethic. All right. He says that because some theologians in the past have said or suggested things that were both racist and anti-Semitic, this is the rationale that's used for deconstructing Western Christianity. Because if even one racist comment is made, then the entire system of Western theology is destructive. It needs to be systematically erased and deconstructed. This is a classic play by those who are anti-racist. All right. And so he says, as such, I will suggest that Christians may benefit from envisaging Jesus as a Middle Eastern Jewish prophet. And so what he's doing here, he's at the very beginning of that line that I just wrote, I will suggest that images of Jesus, the biblical text, and the notions of Christology are more generally remain problematic from an anti-racist perspective. He's saying not only is our idea of a Eurocentric Jesus problematic, he's saying the biblical text is problematic. The Bible itself is problematic in how we understand Jesus today. And so Again, this is a classic play used over and over again by this type of scholar. There is there is not work to deal with, they don't work with the intricacies of, any kind of anti-Semitism or anything. They see an entire system, and if one racist comment is made, the entire system needs to be erased. And so that's how these guys work. And so if you're arguing against traditional and orthodox view of Christ, um, oh, sorry, I got a little bit ahead of myself there. And so he says, this is not in and of itself an attack on Christianity, or rather the many Christianities found around the world. Now, I wanted to say, he says he's not going to attack Christianity, but I wrote down a little note here. It says, you are arguing against the traditional and orthodox view of Christ and seem to be discounting his deity. I think this is an attack. So from the previous paragraph, we got this idea that the idea of Christ is problematic, and the biblical text that talks about Christ is problematic. But then and this is something they do all the time. They try to distance themselves from being someone who's on the attack. He just says, I'm not trying to attack Christianity itself. Well, you're trying to erase 2,000 years of theology based on a couple of comments that some people have made in the past. I do think this is an attack on Christianity. It's not that simple. So he says this is not in and of itself an attack on Christianity, or rather the many Christianities found around the world, nor does it aim to find fault with Christians themselves per se, though some Christianities and some Christians are more at fault than others. Rather, it is to highlight an awareness of tendencies and ingrained habits within the churches and their theologies that can give weight to anti Semitism, and therefore invite them to be alert that they still need to be combated. As a recent article in this journal noted, the churches still have much work to do on the Christian West's primal instincts toward anti Judaic discourse. This is an attempt at what many may term today an anti racist approach and reading of Christianity, with a particular focus on the person of Jesus and, and in relation to Judaism and anti Semitism. Now, this is clever. This is a clever way for Hedges to act. This is a clever way that all critical theorists act. So, at the heart of his argument, he really wants to deconstruct the idea that Jesus is God, but he is going to do it in such a way that your ethical dilemmas of racism and justice will oppose tradition. So, for those people who are not trained to think critically and they don't know their tradition, but they're only trained to uphold anti racism as the highest ethic, then this is going to make complete sense. They are going to deconstruct the entire system. And this is how all of these people operate. This isn't just Paul Hedges here acting like this. No, this is how a theorist, a critical theorist, operates in deconstructing the system. So he moves on. This paper will begin unpacking some conceptual issues. Here, we don't need to read that. Um, Going into the next paragraph. Next, I will move to outline some key markers of anti Semitism within the Christian tradition, dealing primarily with the biblical text and its treatment, but noting also some key church fathers and leading thinkers of the tradition. So he is going to look at the Bible, the commentary, and then also commentaries of the text and leading thinkers in theology to really show how these are anti Semitic, how they're racist, and how the entire system is racist. This fits perfectly in my episode from last week, where I stated that the first major presupposition of critical theory is to merge special revelation with general revelation and our experiences, and carry where those two would kind of equalize, and they carry just as much weight. And really, over time, our experiences carry more weight than God specially revealing himself. The first step to deconstructing the traditional understanding of Christ is to first challenge the authority of Scripture again and against the ethic of anti-racism. So you're faced with these dilemmas, and if you don't know what you're talking about, if you don't know where to pull out the lies of these people and see where they've done shoddy scholarship, then you're going to automatically pick up on this ethic of anti-racist, and you're going to say, oh, we just need to scrap the entire system because racism is bad and it doesn't make me feel good. And so we need to get rid of everything. But that's bad thinking. It's the wrong way to go about this. And so let's see. Now I'm going to move into the next section, and we're not going to read much there because the next section is it's labeled prejudice, anti-racism, racialization, and anti-Semitism concepts and terms. What he's doing in this section is really defining his terms. What does he mean by prejudice? What does he mean by anti-racism? What does he mean by racialization? What does he mean by anti-Semitism? I am largely going to skip over this section. What Hedges is doing in this section is that he is establishing the idea that anti-Semitism is equal with racism. And you might think, well, why is he doing that? That's kind of weird. I would assume he is making this argument because the idea that anti-Semitism is in fact a form of racism is that's not a belief held by all critical theorists. Some critical race theorists have gone so far to suggest that Asians and Jews are actually part of normative white Eurocentric, North American centric culture, and all of them come together and oppress Black people. So, because this section is largely not about theology, I'm going to skip most of it. However, there are a couple quotes that I want to highlight here and talk about for a minute. Let me scroll down to those. He says, in one paragraph, he says, terms such as epistemicide, and that's in quotes, it's in quotation marks there. Epistemicide, spelled Epistemicide. That's a play on words there. He's talking about genocide of epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, how we know what we know. And so he's saying epistemicide, killing off ways of knowing things, committing genocide against different ideas of knowledge. All right. So when he uses that term epistemicide, that's what he's talking about. So terms such as epistemicide have been used to speak about the way that non-Western, that is configured as non-white ways of knowing, thinking, speaking, and acting have been downplayed, derided, and destroyed. Now, this is another common thing that critical theorists do. They'll talk about there are other ways of knowing truth out there. And the white Western man has oppressed other ways of thinking. And the way that we think about philosophy today, it's not really that it has more truth than other forms of truth. It's just that we have oppressed others and we've committed this epistemicide, and we are not allowing these other ways of knowledge to flourish. So the results of this are well described. See, this term is descriptive of the cultural trauma of those whose languages, cultures, and ways of life have been subaltern to hegemonic colonial and neo-colonial languages, cultures, and ways of life. And he's got all of the words there. Good for him. So he's got the playbook of the critical theory right there. Now, this is where it gets really important. Power production, academic knowledge, and legitimate ways of seeing the world have been vested within a Eurocentric matrix of domination tied to colonialism and neo-colonialism. So what he's saying is that academia, what we understand as, the amount of scholars out there, the biblical scholars out there, academia is really about power. It's about seeing the world through a Eurocentric matrix. And that has happened through forms of colonialism and neo-colonialism. We Western white people are taking our theology and we're committing colonialism and neo-colonialism by insisting that people around the world believe that theology as well. So whatever. I mean, that's what he says. I really don't think that's exactly how it happens, but you can decide. To be anti-racist or to decolonize our social systems and our very ways of knowing is therefore seen to be a prerequisite. Okay. So if we're going to be anti-racist, if we're going to get rid of entire systems. We have to decolonize our social systems and our ways of knowing. What does that mean? Well, we have to really rethink how this university system works. We have to rethink how seminaries work. We have to rethink how the church does theology. I'm just thinking off the top of my head there, but he's really going to he can challenge things like that because the system has a strand of racism is it in it. And if we're truly going to be anti-racist, we have to get rid of the entire system. He says this has been manifested recently in the Black Lives Matter movement and the calls for de- decolonizing university curricula. There you go. We got to rethink universities, toppling statues of slavers, and protesting ongoing inequalities that are often part of the embodied social, political, and economic systems in our world. This paper sets this decolonizing and anti racist agenda within the context of theology and ecclesial ways of knowing and thinking. I just say that a few minutes ago? We have to rethink the way we've done theology. See, white, Western, Eurocentric man has colonized theology throughout the world, and we have to rethink the entire system. And so, what he asks here, the very last question, he says in this paragraph, does anti racism entail decolonizing Jesus? Ooh, that's a big question there because what that entails is, does it mean we have to completely rethink Jesus? Do we have to deny the doctrines that the church has held for 2,000 years? And do we have to change this? So there are two major things happening here. One, Hedges is making the typical play that knowledge, rather than having objective roots or being intuitive, is rather it's completely culturally created. So your knowledge is not something you receive objectively. It's something that is completely culturally creative or created. Taken to its absurd limits, one would have to eventually admit that things like mathematical knowledge are cultural creations of Western society that seek to dominate oppressed groups for the purpose of power. And so we see that purpose of power even in theology, what Hedges is writing here. And so that's a classic play of the critical theorist. Everything is about power. It's not about objective learning. We have certain knowledges and we are colonizing different parts of the world for the purpose of power. The second thing that is happening here is that Hedges is slowly chipping away at any idea of objective or normative interpretation of scripture, and therefore any objective, normative, or traditional interpretation of the doctrine of Christ. If he can convince his readers, you and me, if he can convince us that all knowledge is cultural, then he will gain a huge victory in convincing people that the traditional interpretation of the person and work of Jesus Christ is culturally created and has no objective value. The white Jesus that he is talking about here, or the traditional Christology of the last 2,000 years of the history of the church, is theology used for the drive for power rather than to elaborate the objective truths of Scripture. This again, it's setting the stage for a total departure against traditional theology at the hands of the decolonizing ethic. This is all done at the hands of the anti-racist ethic, because if there is one sin of racism within the whole entire Christian theology system, then we have to get rid of all of it. Now, some of you have probably thought that I was using hyperbole earlier when I had the presuppositions, in the last episode. You probably thought I was crazy, but you can see these things happening right here in this paper. And so actually, this is where I'm going to stop for this episode. Before I'm only about, let's see, only about 40% of the way through the article, and I really want to keep, these episodes under 45 minutes if I can. And so I'm going to stop there. But next time, and I think I'll actually record another one of these this week before Easter. But next time, we're going to talk about Christianity and anti-Semitism, and we're going to talk about a survey of that relationship over the history. We're going to continue in this paper, and Hedges is going to point out different historical places or historical events that contribute to this anti-Semitism. And so what we're going to see even more next week is these presuppositions that I stated. They're going to play out even more. So if you've made it this far into the podcast, I thank you for listening. I appreciate it so much. I pray that this has enlightened you a little bit, that you have learned something. And I pray you just continue studying, keep learning, and may God enlighten you and illuminate you. Thank you, and God bless.